It was the autumn of 1987 when Hazel Tremblay found herself standing alone in the doorway of a barn that smelled like rust and old straw, holding a ring of keys that suddenly felt much heavier than they should. She was 28 years old. She had just buried her father, and she had just learned from a lawyer with a dry cough and a manila envelope that she was now the sole owner of 460 acres of Quebec's eastern townships, along with 3 tractors in various states of disrepair, a herd of 42 Holsteins, a leaking silo, and a mortgage that her father had been quietly refinancing for the last 6 years without telling anyone. Her brother Theodore had taken one look at the numbers and driven back to Montreal the same evening. He didn't slam the door. That was the thing about Theo. He never made scenes. He simply said, "Hazel, be reasonable," kissed her on the forehead, and left. His taillights disappeared down the gravel lane and curved around the hill of maples, and then the farm was hers. All of it, the good and the broken and the deeply, quietly indebted. Let me set the scene for you, because the world Hazel was stepping into matters as much as the woman herself. The late 1980s in rural Quebec were a particular kind of hard. The dairy supply management system had brought some stability compared to what grain farmers out west were enduring. But input costs had risen sharply. The big co-ops were pushing farmers to modernize, buy new milking parlors, upgrade feed systems, bring in quota on credit. The agricultural credit banks had been generous through the early part of the decade, and many farmers in her county had borrowed against that generosity with the faith of men who had never seen a bank call a note before. Her neighbors in Saint-Édouard de l'Haute-Binière were not struggling the way prairie farmers were, but they were stretched. And they watched the Tremblay farm with the particular sorrowful attention of people who had already made up their minds about the outcome. Her father, Émile Tremblay, had been a man who resisted trends with quiet stubbornness. He had never expanded beyond what he could manage himself, and with one hired hand, he had purchased his last piece of equipment, a 1974 Massey Ferguson 165, at a farm auction in Victoriaville, and had treated it with a devotion that bordered on religious. He kept his herd small and his records meticulous, but his one blind spot, the thing that had undone him in the end, was his silence. He had borrowed to cover 2 bad years, 1984 and 1985, when a summer drought had cratered his hay yields, and he had told no one, not Hazel, not Theo, not their mother, who had passed in 1983. He had carried it alone, the way men of his generation carried most things, and it had contributed, the doctor said with careful language, to the strain on his heart. So Hazel inherited the land, and she inherited the secret, and she inherited the consequence of both. The morning after Theo left, she drove the old Dodge farm truck into town. Not to the notary this time. To the credit union on Rue Principale, where a man named Mr. Fournier had managed the Tremblay file for 11 years. He was a careful man, polished shoes, a cardigan, reading glasses on a cord around his neck. He had known her father. He had offered condolences at the funeral with the sincerity of a man who genuinely meant them and the composure of a man who had learned to separate sentiment from numbers. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk and offered her coffee, which she declined. She didn't want to be comfortable. She wanted to be clear-headed. "Hazel," he said, opening the folder, "I want to be frank with you, because I think your father would have wanted that. The outstanding balance on the operating line is significant. With the refinancing he did in '85 and the interest that's accumulated," he turned the page to face her and slid it across the desk. She looked at the number. She didn't let her face change. "There's also the matter of the quota," he continued. "If you're planning to continue dairy operations, you'll need to maintain the herd." But to service this debt and cover your input costs through to next spring's milk checks, you'll need capital you don't currently have access to." He paused then, with the timing of a man who had rehearsed this part. "I've had a preliminary conversation with a gentleman from an agricultural consolidation group out of Sherbrooke. They've been acquiring family operations in this area. Good land, good quota. They're offering fair value. More than fair, honestly. Enough to settle the debt completely and leave you with a remainder worth starting over somewhere smaller." He looked at her with the kind eyes of someone offering a lifeboat. Hazel set the paper back on the desk. "I'm not selling," she said. Mr. Fournier blinked. He was quiet for a moment. "Hazel, I understand the numbers," she said, "and I'm not selling." He leaned back slightly. "The milk checks won't cover the debt service on their own, not at current quota levels. You'd need to either increase production, which requires capital, or reduce the debt load. And to reduce the debt load without selling assets, you need income streams that don't currently exist on that operation." He was not unkind. He was simply thorough. "Your father was a good farmer, but the operation as structured isn't viable as is. Not without changes." "Then I'll make changes," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. He saw a young woman who had just buried her father and lost her brother in the span of a single week. He thought he was seeing grief, wearing the mask of determination. He was not entirely wrong about the grief. He was entirely wrong about the rest. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was what Hazel had spent the last 8 years doing quietly, in the background of her own life. She had come back to the farm after a year of agricultural college in St. Hyacinthe, not because she had failed at anything else, but because her father had needed help and she had chosen to give it. While she was there, she had taken over the maintenance log. Emile had kept records of every repair, every parts purchase, every service interval. But in the last few years, his eyesight had made the fine print of service manuals difficult, and Hazel had become his reader, then his mechanic's assistant, then, gradually, and without ceremony, his mechanic. She knew those machines the way you know a person you've lived alongside for years. She knew that the MF-165 ran hot in July and needed the coolant checked every morning during haying. She knew that the International 484, the smaller of the two working tractors, had a governor that crept high under load and needed adjusting every spring. She knew that the hydraulic pump on the loader tractor had been rebuilt in 1983 with a seal kit from a supplier in Drummondville, and she had the part number written in her father's logbook in her own handwriting because she had been the one to call it in. Her father had taught her, but not with lectures. He taught her by letting her be present, by handing her the wrench instead of taking it back, by asking, "What do you hear?" when an engine sounded off, and waiting, genuinely waiting, for her answer before offering his own. Have you ever met someone who could walk into a barn and tell you, just from the smell, whether a cow was off her feed before she showed any other signs? That was Emile Tremblay, and he had passed that particular attention, that quality of noticing, to his daughter. In the same way he passed everything, not through instruction, but through example, by being the kind of person who paid attention, day after day, until it became the only way she knew how to be. The third night, after the visit to the credit union, Hazel went out to the equipment shed after supper. The air was cold and smelled of coming frost. She pulled the chain on the overhead light, a single fluorescent tube that flickered twice before holding, and stood looking at the loader tractor. The hydraulic cylinder on the front bucket had been weeping fluid for 2 months. She had noticed it in August, mentioned it to her father, and he had said they would get to it after haying. They had not gotten to it after haying. Then he was sick. Then he was gone. She went to the shelf where he kept his manuals, 3 ring binders, their spines soft from handling, their pages dense with specifications and exploded diagrams, and found the section on the loader assembly. She traced the diagram with her finger. She pulled out his logbook and read backward through the hydraulic entries until she found the last time the seals had been replaced. Spring of 1981. 6 years. Reasonable wear. She made a list: cylinder seal kit, O-rings for the fitting connections, a liter of hydraulic fluid to top up once the repair was complete. She would drive to the co-op in the morning. The repair took her 2 full days. The cylinder was corroded at the base, where a slow leak had allowed moisture in, and she had to cut away a section of the hydraulic line and replace it as well. Something she hadn't anticipated, which meant a second trip to the co-op and the better part of an afternoon waiting for the replacement hose to be cut and fitted. She did the work in the cold shed with her father's tools and her father's manuals and a trouble light hung from a hook in the rafters. And when she finished, when she raised that bucket and held it overhead and watched for the drip that didn't come, she sat down on the concrete floor for a minute and breathed. The first winter was a sustained act of problem solving. She had 42 cows to milk twice a day, 7 days a week, regardless of what else needed doing. The milk checks came in every 2 weeks and went directly against the debt. She renegotiated a small part of the operating line with Mr. Fournier, not enough to be comfortable, but enough to buy feed through to spring without liquidating the herd. She let the hired hand go. She couldn't afford him. She did his work herself. She did not tell people how tight it was. The neighbors saw her lights on in the shed at 10 o'clock and assumed the worst. They saw her driving the old truck with the muffler that needed replacing and assumed she couldn't manage. They saw a young woman doing the work of 2 people, and they mistook the fatigue for failure. They did not see the ledger on her kitchen table, where every expenditure was tracked to the dollar and every milk check was allocated before it arrived. She bartered where she could. Her neighbor, Mr. Cassette, had a round baler she needed access to for the second hay cut. She spent 3 days in October helping his crew put up firewood, cutting, splitting, stacking, in exchange for 2 weeks with the baler. She repaired the hydraulic top link on the tractor belonging to old Mr. Bergeron 2 concessions over in exchange for the use of his manure spreader. She was building a network of reciprocal obligation, one careful exchange at a time, which is how farming communities in Quebec have sustained themselves for 300 years, and which the people who wanted her to sell had somehow forgotten. There was a night in February, the worst night, when the barn heating system failed during a cold snap that dropped the temperature to -30 with the wind. She discovered it at the 11 o'clock milking. The water lines in the barn were already cold to the touch. She had 2 hours, maybe 3, before the pipes in the milk house began to freeze. She called no one. There was no one to call at that hour who could arrive in time to matter. She went back to the shed, found the wiring diagram for the heating unit, stapled to the inside of the electrical panel cover, put there by her father years ago in a moment of unusual foresight, and traced the fault to a seized relay switch. The part she needed was not something she had on hand, but she had an old barn heater in the back of the shed, a propane unit her father had used years ago during calving, and she dragged it into the barn and got it running and kept the temperature above freezing for the rest of the night. She sat in the barn until 4 in the morning, watching the thermometer. The cows were restless at first, and then settled. The pipes held. At some point she leaned her head back against the barn boards and closed her eyes for a few minutes and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, about selling, about Theo's careful face and the apartment he had in Rosemont and the life that existed somewhere outside of this particular barn on this particular February night. And then a cow shifted beside her, heavy and warm, and pressed her flank against the slat, and Hazel opened her eyes. She thought about her father's logbook, specifically about an entry she had found in November when she was going back through the early years. 1969, the year he had bought the farm. His handwriting then was younger, more angular. The entry was about a broken PTO shaft, a repair that had taken him a week because he'd had to fabricate a part. At the end of the entry, he had written something she had not expected. Worst week since we started, but the land is still here. The land is always still here. She had read it standing at the workbench and had to stop for a moment. She thought about it now, in the barn at 3:30 in the morning, and she got up and went to the milk house and put the kettle on the propane burner she kept out there, and she made herself a cup of instant coffee, and she waited for morning. The relay switch came from a supplier in Quebec City 2 days later. She installed it herself. She had been living her father's philosophy without naming it. Keep the debt small. Trust your own hands. Fix what you have before you consider what you want. Her input costs were lower than her neighbors because she didn't pay for repairs she could make herself, and because she wasn't servicing the kind of debt loads that required volume at any cost. Her milk was consistent. Her herd health was good because she paid attention, because she had learned from a man who believed that observation was the most important farm tool. By the second year, something in the ledger had begun to shift. Not dramatically. This is not that kind of story. But perceptibly, the operating line was shorter than it had been in November of the year before. The milk quality bonus from the Fédération was consistent. She had sold 3 cull cows at good prices in the fall and reinvested nothing, putting the money directly against principal. The crisis, when it came for other people. In 1990, interest rates climbed again. The Bank of Canada was fighting inflation, and the prime rate went up sharply, and farmers who had been operating on thin margins with high debt suddenly found themselves in serious trouble. It was not as catastrophic as what had happened on the prairies in the mid-'80s, but in her county, it was real. For sale signs appeared on 2 operations she knew well. The Deschamps place, which had expanded aggressively in '87, and a younger family 2 concessions north who had taken on quota credit the year before at exactly the wrong moment. Mr. Fournier called to check in. He asked carefully how she was managing. She told him honestly. He was quiet for a moment. "You're the healthiest operation I'm dealing with right now," he said, in a tone that suggested this surprised him more than it should have. "I know," she said, not to be unkind, just because it was true. The vindication, when it came, arrived in 2 parts. The first was Mr. Fournier himself, who came out to the farm on a Tuesday in May of 1991. He had never visited before. He parked his car at the end of the lane and walked up to where she was working on the fence line at the south pasture, checking posts after the spring thaw. He stood for a moment, looking at the farm. The barn was sound. The pastures were coming in well. She had overseeded the previous fall with a mix her father had sworn by, and which the agronomist at the co-op had called old-fashioned, and which had again worked exactly as promised. The herd was out, moving steadily across the field in the particular unhurried way of healthy cows. "I've been meaning to come out," he said. He held his hat in his hands, which she had never seen him do before. "I wanted to tell you something I should have said 2 years ago." She waited. "When you came into my office in the fall of '87, I believed you were making a decision based on grief, not on judgment." He looked at the fence post she had been setting. "I was wrong. I offered you a way out because I thought you needed one. I didn't see that you already had a way forward." He looked at her directly. "Your father was a man I didn't fully appreciate until I could see what he had built, not in the land but in you. Hazel set down her fencing tool. She looked at him. "He would have been proud," Mr. Fournier said, "and I am sorry I underestimated you." She shook his hand. He had the handshake of a man who meant what he was saying. The second came 3 months later, on a Saturday afternoon in August, when a truck she recognized pulled into the yard. Theo had not been back since the night he left. He had called, occasionally, in the first year. Short conversations, careful and slightly guilty, with silences that neither of them filled well. She had not blamed him for leaving. She had never blamed him for leaving. He had his own life, his own calculations, and she understood, more than he probably knew, that some people are built for staying and some people are built for going. And the grace is in knowing which you are. He got out of the truck slowly. He was thinner than she remembered. He had the look of a man who had been carrying something. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood in the yard and looked at the farm the way you look at something when you're trying to reconcile what you expected with what you're seeing. The barn, the herd in the distance, the kitchen garden her father had always kept, which she had kept going too, the MF 165 parked by the equipment shed, its red paint faded, but its engine, she had rebuilt the carburetor in the spring, running as well as it ever had. "I heard from Cousin Paulette that you paid the mortgage down by half," he said finally. "Almost half," she said. He nodded slowly. He was working up to something. "I told you to sell," he said. "I sat in this yard and told you to sell, and I drove away." He looked at her. "I was afraid. I didn't think you could do it, and I was afraid that if I stayed and tried to help and you still lost it, I would." He stopped. "I didn't want to watch you fail. And that was a cowardly reason to leave." She waited because she had learned, over the last few years, that waiting was often the more useful thing. "You didn't fail," he said. The words came out with the weight of something he had been carrying for a long time. "I should have known you wouldn't. I knew you better than anyone, and I still didn't trust what I knew." She crossed the yard and stood next to him, and they both looked at the farm together for a moment. The fields, the barn, the hills running south toward the townships, everything their father had left them. "Do you want to stay for supper?" she said. He did. "Now let me take you forward because Hazel Tremblay's story doesn't end in 1991. She is in her early 50s now, and the farm is still there, still 460 acres. Still in the eastern townships, still Tremblay land. She never expanded for the sake of expanding. When the Deschamps property came up at an estate sale in 1996, she bought the 20 acres adjacent to her south pasture. With cash, from savings she had rebuilt one milk check at a time, because it improved her rotation and she had wanted that field since she was 12 years old. That was the extent of her ambition for scale. The debt is gone. Has been since 1998. She paid the last of it on a Thursday in November, and she drove home from the credit union and stopped at the gate at the end of the lane and sat in the truck for a few minutes before going in. She didn't celebrate, exactly. She just sat there and let it be over. The farm is known now in a way it wasn't when her father was running it. Not famous, nothing so large as that, but known. The agronomists from the local UPI office bring student groups out in the spring to look at her pasture management. A young couple who bought the old Bergeron place came to her last year with questions about herd health that her father would have known the answers to, and she answered them. And they came back a month later with more questions, and she answered those too. She is not precious about the knowledge. Her father wasn't, and she isn't. Theo comes back now, regularly. He retired from his engineering firm 3 years ago, and he is taken to spending part of each summer on the farm doing what he can, which is less than he thinks, but more than nothing. And she finds she doesn't mind the company. His daughter, her niece Camille, spent last summer on the farm at age 19, and showed the kind of attention, the way she watched the animals, the way she asked questions that got at the root of things rather than the surface, that Hazel recognizes. She took Camille out to the equipment shed one afternoon and showed her the logbooks, her father's with its angular handwriting, her own continuation of it in a second notebook that picks up where his left off, maintaining the same format, the same precision. Every repair, every part's number, every observation about what the machines were telling her. "Your great-grandfather started this farm," Hazel told her. "Your grandfather kept it. Your grandfather taught me to keep it." She handed Camille a grease gun and pointed to the wheel hub on the old manure spreader. "Before you do anything else, you need to know what this machine needs. Not what the manual says it needs, what this machine needs. They're not always the same." She showed her where to put the tip, how to apply even pressure, when to stop. "And when you're done, listen to it. If you spin the hub and it sounds different than it did before, that's the machine telling you something." Camille listened. She asked good questions. The men in town, the ones who had spoken in low voices at the co-op about what would happen to the Tremblay place, had been wrong in the particular way that people are wrong when they see a situation and immediately imagine the worst of it. They had seen a young woman alone and a pile of debt, and they had calculated an outcome. They had not calculated for the contents of an old logbook on a shelf in a cold shed, or for the quality of attention that a quiet man had spent 30 years cultivating in his daughter. The machines outlasted the doubt. The land, as it always does, rewarded patience over panic, and the knowledge, the specific, grease-stained, hard-won knowledge of what each machine needed and when and why, turned out to be the only asset that could not be refinanced, could not be repossessed, and could not be driven away in a truck heading back to Montreal. Her father had believed something that the consolidation groups and the credit managers had never quite understood. That farming is not a business you run on a spreadsheet. It is a relationship you maintain with a piece of ground year after year, learning its moods and its needs and its limits, giving back to it what you take, and trusting, with a patience that looks from the outside like stubbornness, that the land will remember. Hazel Tremblay had held that trust through 2 bad winters and a cold relay switch and a February barn at 3 in the morning and a brother driving away in the dark. She had held it through every number on every sheet of paper that Mr. Fournier had slid across his desk. The land remembered. It always does.